Hello, everyone. This is Pam Moore, Director of the New Mexico Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program. I'm also part of the New Mexico Wellbeing Committee, and I'm here to introduce Legal Wellbeing in Action, a podcast series offered by the New Mexico Wellbeing Committee. Last year was the first full year of the Wellbeing Committee at work. In identifying ways to bring well-being education and initiatives to the New Mexico legal community, we created a 2021 campaign called What a Healthy Lawyer Looks Like. 2021 is dedicated to educating the New Mexico legal community on a variety of well-being topics that pertain to work and home life. Our goal is that every judge, lawyer, law student, and legal staff person can find some aspect of their mental, emotional, physical, or spiritual health to improve upon. We strive to educate, encourage, and support the New Mexico legal community to show up as their best self in all aspects of life, which means we will be covering a wide variety of topics that relate to the whole human self. Thank you for being here today listening to Legal Wellbeing in Action.
Hello everyone, Tanessa Akins here. I am the Clinical Coordinator for the New Mexico Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program, and I am also the podcast series coordinator. This month's episode will be featuring the very important topic of sleep. As part of the 2021 campaign, What a Healthy Lawyer Looks Like, we are featuring monthly wellness topics in the articles published to the State Bar of New Mexico's Bar Bulletin, and airing each month's topic in our podcast episodes. To learn more about this campaign or to view those articles, please visit the New Mexico Wellbeing Committee's webpage at www.sbnm.org. For any further questions or to learn about how you can get involved, please email me, Tanessa Akins, at teakins@sbnm.org. I will now turn it over to you, Pam, to introduce yourself, our guest speaker, and the fascinating topic of sleep. Thank you all for tuning into Legal Wellbeing in Action. We hope you enjoy.
Well, thank you, Tanessa. Greetings, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Legal Wellbeing in Action podcast. I am Pam Moore, and I oversee the New Mexico Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program. Today, our topic is a very important one. We'll be discussing all things sleep, how it impacts our waking life, what is circadian rhythm, what we can do if we have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, and what is the healthy amount of sleep to get at different age or activity levels. So today I'm honored to be joined by a local sleep expert and pulmonologist, Dr. Lee Brown. Dr. Brown, welcome.
Thank you.
Before we dive into talking about all things sleep, which I'm really excited to talk about today, it's so important, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself? So I think the listeners would be interested in how you got interested in this topic and how you became an expert on the science or medicine of sleep. What work roles do you have in the New Mexico community? And more importantly, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you after hearing this podcast, what would be the best way for them to do that? So again, welcome. I'm honored to have you here today. I'm so glad that you decided to join us.
My pleasure. So it's a convoluted story. I started out as an electrical engineer as an undergraduate, but developed an interest in medical engineering and biology and went to medical school, became board certified in internal medicine, pulmonary disease. And when I did my pulmonary fellowship, it was at an institution in Miami that had one of the very first sleep disorders programs in the country. At the time, there were only about 3. And so even though I wasn't being trained specifically in sleep medicine, I was exposed to a great deal of sleep medicine during my training. And when I became a faculty member at Mount Sinai in New York, they had no sleep program at all. And I decided to create one. I can say through courses and interactions with the first generation of sleep medicine experts, I was taught I'm a second generation sleep medicine practitioner, having been taught by the first generation. And the first generation goes back to the inception of sleep medicine, which was probably in the early 1970s. So I have been practicing sleep medicine now for close to 39 years. The thing about sleep medicine is when you begin the way I did, when it's only a very struggling beginning specialty in medicine and in science, it becomes a calling. It's more than just an interesting thing to do or a way to make a living. I see sleep disorders, and sleep medicine as something that is of extreme importance to learn about, to care for patients who have sleep problems, and to delve into the science of sleep. And so that's me. Currently, I'm a tenured full professor of internal medicine and pediatrics at the University of New Mexico. I practice sleep medicine at our sleep disorders centers. And I also still practice inpatient pulmonary medicine on the inpatient pulmonary consult service, taking my turns to cover pulmonary patients in the hospital. I'm also active at the state level in various ways. I chair the Polysomnographic Policy Advisory Committee of the New Mexico Medical Board, and I chair the Advisory Board for Respiratory Care for the state of New Mexico. I do a lot of other things, but I think that pretty much sums it up for this presentation. You can get in contact with me at my email, which is lkbrown @salud, SALUD.UNM.edu.
Great, thank you very much. And we will make sure and also give out your email address again at the end of the podcast. So while you were talking, what came up for me in terms of a curiosity is, can you define for the listeners what sleep medicine means? So what is that? Is that the study of sleep, or what does it mean to be studying sleep medicine?
So we really call it in a more general term, which is sleep-wake disorders. Because how you sleep and what quality of sleep you get affects your wakeful function as well. And there are even disorders where people, when they should be awake, are actually preferred to be asleep. So the field encompasses both sleep and wakefulness. And there are over 100 defined sleep disorders. We have an international classification of sleep disorders that our professional organization publishes, and it's in its 3rd edition now. And it defines more than 100 different sleep disorders that a sleep medicine practitioner is familiar with, diagnoses in patients who are seen, and applies treatment or treatments that have emerged through research over the years.
Wow. I had no idea there were over 100 disorders when it comes to sleep. That's very interesting. I would think most people wouldn't know that. So, well, good. I'm glad we're talking about this. So that kind of leads into my first question is, why do our bodies and our brains need sleep? Why is it so important to a human being? And then I guess the second part of that would be, and maybe this is included, is what is happening in our bodies when we sleep. Maybe that also is why it's so important.
Well, sleep is actually a very active process. It's not like being in a coma or being anesthetized. There are lots of important things that go on during sleep. And in fact, there are two very different states of sleep that happen to both occur in humans at the same time, but really bear no relationship to each other. So there's something called non-REM sleep, which takes up the bulk of our sleep time. And there's something called rapid eye movement or REM sleep, which is a totally different sleep state that bears very little resemblance to non-REM sleep, and it appears to have different functions. One of the things about REM sleep is that most of our muscles are paralyzed during REM sleep. The way we explain that is in order not to act out our dreams, because that's when dreaming occurs. And if REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, or dreaming sleep occurred at any other time during our non-REM sleep, then it would be very inconvenient to suddenly become paralyzed when you're awake. That, in fact, is one of the symptoms of narcolepsy type 1. They develop something called cataplexy, which is an intrusion of the paralysis of REM sleep during wakefulness in response to strong emotion.
Wow. So that's a lot. So our brains and bodies, it's so important. I'm getting that, there's different cycles or there's different phases that we are in when we are sleeping. And each one of those is having a hand in keeping our brains and our bodies healthy. You said we're very active when we are asleep. It's not a passive state that we're in. And there's a reason for that. And so if we're not getting enough sleep or we're not cycling, I guess, through those phases that you talked about, REM, there's a deep sleep. What would happen? How would we feel during the day? I guess what would happen in our wakeful hours if we're not doing that proper cycling? And then can you also talk about maybe the length of time that we're in those cycles at night?
So the first obvious consequence of not getting enough sleep would be being sleepy during the day, tending to doze off, including during important tasks like driving. But for someone who does professional work, such as an attorney, falling asleep reviewing case records on the computer or on paper, or looking for case law with respect to something they're working on. Anything sedentary during wakefulness, if you do not get enough sleep and your drive to try to gain more sleep is high enough, then you will tend to doze off when you would rather not. And it also affects things like your ability to concentrate. If you're sleepy, it's hard to concentrate. Interestingly enough, it affects moral decisions. So if you there are computer programs that present moral ambiguities on the screen, and the person being tested is asked to make choices that are based on morality and or ethics. People who are sleep deprived tend to make the wrong decisions. In addition, I mentioned this briefly, but it's a major cause of motor vehicle accidents. There's a huge problem in the trucking industry with accidents caused by falling asleep. Those data are not necessarily captured when the accident report is recorded. They usually just say driver in attention. But in many, if not most cases, it's driver falling asleep. And that tends to be because the trucking industry, number one, their schedules are very long. And there's always a tension between when they need to be driving and when they can catch some sleep. And also truck drivers don't have necessarily, and this is a stereotype, but unfortunately it's true, don't necessarily have the best ways of taking care of themselves. They eat a lot of fast food, they don't get a lot of exercise, and they tend to be overweight, if not obese. And that leads to a very high percentage of truck drivers having obstructive sleep apnea, which is the second most common sleep disorder and is a major cause of sleepiness during wakefulness and therefore a cause of accidents. In addition, a lot of drivers, truck drivers, if not other kinds of drivers, tend to insist on driving during peak hours of sleepiness. There's something called a circadian rhythm that governs our drive to be awake. And the drive to be awake under this circadian rhythm, 24-hour rhythm, dips during the middle of the night. So the drive to be awake is at its minimum during your normal sleep period. And if you insist on driving, then you might have a problem with sleepiness and inattention and accidents due to falling asleep. There have been a lot of episodes in the news over the years about truck accidents, about railroad accidents, about not so much airplane accidents because they take major precautions against sleepiness. But in a lot of the transportation industry and in parts of other industries that run around the clock and have shift work, accidents happen because the workers are trying to work when their body is telling them they should be asleep.
Yeah. Great, thank you for that. That's a lot of information. So let's talk a little bit, I guess, what is the recommended hours of sleep that somebody would need during the night? Let's say, attorneys are notorious for having to work long hours. Probably doctors are too. So what would be the recommended time to go to sleep? What would be the recommended number of hours to go to sleep? I know, I read babies need, a lot more hours than adults do, but what we typically hear is 6 to 8 hours, with probably I hear more about 8 hours of sleep, a solid 8 hours of sleep a night. So is that true? Can people function just fine on less? And, is it in our 20s when we should, we're at that 8 hour and we should maintain that for the rest of our lives? So what should people be aiming for? And what time, maybe what time is a good time to go to sleep?
Okay, well, those are two very distinct questions, actually. So how much sleep we require follows, as does a lot of things in biology, a bell-shaped curve. That is, there's a peak where the majority of people, the defined amount of sleep they require is 8 to 8.5 hours for most adults, and that would apply to 18 years of age and above, typically. Mm-hmm. But there are individuals on either side of the peak of that bell-shaped curve who require different amounts of sleep in order to function well during the day. There are some people who require 10 hours of sleep, 9 hours of sleep. There are some people who get by just fine on 5 hours of sleep. there are historical figures who are said to have been able to get along quite well on 4 or 5 hours of sleep. Leonardo Da Vinci, Thomas Edison, for instance, are often brought up as examples, although it's also added, as far as Thomas Edison is concerned, that he seemed to take a lot of naps during the day. Don't know about Leonardo, but it's a biologically determined process that is unique to each individual. And each individual has to determine how much sleep is adequate for themselves in order to function well the next day and not be sleepy.
Got it. And so so I totally get that. What would be the signs then? We didn't really talk about, I guess, timing on when people should be sleeping. I know there you said there's a dip in our circadian rhythm, and that's when we should be sleeping. And then there's a wake time where our body's more alert and awake. But let's talk about, since you mentioned some people, it's up to each person to determine how much sleep they really need. So what would be the signs somebody should pay attention to?
Well, the timing of sleep actually varies with an individual's biology, just like the amount of sleep that is needed. There are people who are comfortable with a normal sleep-wake cycle, which would probably be defined as a bedtime of around 10 or 11 p.m. and getting in their 8 to 8.5 hours of sleep and falling asleep within 30 minutes is considered normal. Actually, below 10 minutes would be considered excessively sleepy. Having a minimal number of awakenings that are brief during the night. Everybody actually, when we test normal people in the sleep laboratory, it's known that people have about 11 brief arousals per hour of sleep just normally, but they don't usually amount to very much. And when you conclude your 8 to 8.5 hours of sleep, whatever time in the morning that turns out to be, that's a normal sleep cycle. That's what probably the majority of people do. On the other hand, there are people who have an advanced sleep phase, and there are people who have a delayed sleep phase. Both of those are probably inherited. If you look into the family history, the pedigree of adults who have the tendency to want to have an early bedtime and get up early, those are the ones with the advanced sleep-wake phase. That tends to run in their families. If you look at older adults, middle-aged adults, say past their 20s, who prefer to fall asleep, to have a bedtime in the early morning, say midnight or 1 a.m., and to sleep into the late morning, you will find that they have relatives that have preferred the same sleep schedule. And there are mutations in genes that affect the circadian rhythm of wakefulness drive that have been identified that are associated with each of these, what are called phenotypes, people who prefer to go to sleep early and wake up early, and people who prefer to go to bed late and wake up late. And we call them larks and owls. That's how we refer to them. And it's probably an inherited phenomenon, as I said, but also there's a very important aspect of it that has to do with adolescents and young adults. And that is, it has been absolutely bulletproof proven that adolescents and young adults have a biologic tendency to delay their sleep phase. So they are biologically driven to have late bedtimes and prefer to sleep later into the morning. And that usually goes away as they become more mature. Sometimes it doesn't. Those are the ones who most likely are genetically predisposed to delayed sleep. But the problem with adolescents and young adults is that this occurs during the times when they're in high school and college. And the tradition here in the US has always been that high school classes start early, and middle school and younger classes start later. And it should actually be exactly the opposite. There have been studies in cities that have realized that this biology is important. It's also been studied in other countries that if you switch the start times around so that high schoolers' start times are later in the morning and middle schoolers and primary schoolers start earlier, which they're perfectly happy to do, the performance of the high schoolers scholastically improves. Lots of things about their mood improve. Their degree of sleepiness improves, and that has been measured by observing whether they fall asleep in their morning classes, for instance. And so there is a movement among sleep experts and some enlightened parents and school officials to take notice of this biologic tendency and switch things around so that high schoolers start school later in the morning. The problem is there are so many other activities and needs that interfere with doing that. Because this has been the way it has been for so long, there is a very strong fight against trying to do that, because you need to change busing schedules, you need to change athletic practice schedules, you need to change band practice schedules, all kinds. It interferes with when parents can be relieved of childcare and need to go to work. It's an extremely complicated issue.
Right.
It's an important one, and it really has important consequences.
The Solutions Group, the State Bar of New Mexico's EAP provider, offers confidential and free professional counselors to support employees and their direct family members by offering short-term counseling, assessment, and referrals for any life struggle. This includes drug addiction, relationship conflict, anxiety, depression, and grief and loss. Other services include dependent care, crisis assessment, intervention, and educational presentations, free well-being webinars, and an online stress assessment tool. Call 505-254-3555 or 1-866-254-3555 and identify with NMJ Lab to schedule an appointment or video visit.
Right. Yeah, I remember that discussion several years ago. I've got two kids of my own, and I remember that being on the news and just a large amount of discussion and debate over when high schoolers should be going to school. So I do remember that. Thank you for explaining all that. So, I guess getting back to what people should be looking out for if they think they are sleepy during the day, or maybe they're not, they're kind of in a brain fog. They don't really know what's going on. Maybe they're, I know, attorneys tend to be stressed out a lot of the time. They work on really hard cases. They have a hard job. And so what should they be looking out for in terms of signs, maybe that they're not, that maybe sleep is something they should be getting more of? What would point them to the direction of, hey, maybe I'm not getting enough sleep? And then let's talk a little bit about if somebody has trouble falling asleep, can you recommend some tools or some tips? Or if they have trouble staying asleep, can you recommend those things that would allow somebody to get the best possible night's sleep they can?
Sure. So I know with many lawyers, it's all about billable hours. And until they become a partner in their firm, it's all about showing just how many hours they can bill for and what they're worth to the firm would be were they to be made an associate. And so there's a great deal of tension involved. And then, as you say, if you're working on a criminal case or other important cases that require a great deal of work in writing pleadings and the other things lawyers do, I'm sure there's a tendency to work at the expense of sleep. The problem is that if you don't get the amount of sleep that you, through your own experience during your life, know you need in order not to be sleepy the next day, then the next day you're going to have difficulty concentrating. You may doze off when you're trying to research things about a case or case law. There are a whole myriad of things. You know, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know everything lawyers do, but I could even imagine a lawyer falling asleep in court. Supreme Court justices have been caught falling asleep. I think there was one interesting incident that occurred at a State of the Union speech to Congress, and the Supreme Court assembled, where one of the justices was seen to fall asleep and created quite a hubbub. So if you don't get enough sleep, it impairs you when you need not to be impaired and to be at your best. And those really are the most important aspects of getting enough sleep and getting the amount of sleep that you need that is set by your biology in terms of both timing and length. As far as people who have insomnia, so insomnia is more a syndrome than it is a diagnosis. Insomnia means having difficulty either falling asleep at the beginning of the night, waking up during the night, and or having difficulty falling back to sleep, or waking up too early. And it's combined with daytime dysfunction, either sleepiness or what you describe as brain fog or lack of concentration. And there are many, many causes of insomnia. It's a complicated issue, and they're some of the most complicated patients that we see because there are so many causes of insomnia. Some of the most important causes are not giving yourself enough time to wind down in the evening before bedtime. So if you are used to, I always tell patients, don't balance your checkbook. I'm not sure people do that anymore, but don't look at your finances just before bed. It will only make you stressed. But don't do other things that are stressful within 1 to 2 hours before sleep. Do something relaxing. Do something that lets you wind down from the problems of the day. One of the treatments for sleep onset insomnia that we recommend is making a worry list, that is listing the things that you are anxious about and writing them down and writing down what you plan to do about them. And in some individuals who take on that practice, they're able to convince themselves when it's bedtime, well, I've already thought about this. I've decided what I'm going to do. And I don't need to worry about it. I just need to fall asleep. There are other aspects of improving sleep onset insomnia and other types of insomnia. So some people have a sleep disorder that interferes with them falling asleep. The most common would be restless legs syndrome. That's a clinical diagnosis, one of the 100 plus sleep disorders. And it is defined clinically as an irresistible urge to move your legs. You may or may not have what we call a dysesthesia, some sort of discomfort in the legs. But that feeling is relieved to some extent or completely, but briefly, by moving the legs or walking around. And then when they go back to being sedentary, the same urge returns. Typically, that follows this circadian rhythm that I mentioned before. It's virtually always worse at bedtime, which is a bad time to have this disorder because it interferes with sleep, and it can extend into the sleep period so that some people may wake up during the night, for instance, to use the restroom, and then experience restless legs and have difficulty falling back to sleep. One of the major causes of restless leg syndrome is a modest degree of iron deficiency, not enough to cause anemia, but enough to affect the way the brain functions so that it brings on restless legs. There are also a whole panoply of medications that are effective to treat restless legs. And one of the jobs of a sleep physician when a patient complains of these symptoms is to, number one, have an iron level drawn and treat that if it's low. And number two, think about what medication might be appropriate for an individual patient to treat their restless legs. And it's not always a hypnotic, a sleeping pill. Usually it's something quite different that works on the way the brain is causing restless legs to occur. There are other causes of insomnia, probably mental health disorders would be very high up on the list. Depression, anxiety disorders, other psychiatric disorders like bipolar disorder during the manic times, all will interfere with falling asleep. That's a very common problem. And there are environmental causes of difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, having too much light in the bedroom, too much noise, perhaps their bed partner snores, perhaps they leave the television on all night. These are things that tend to delay the onset of sleep for two reasons, which I'll get into, but also disturb the continuity of sleep. But watching television or using personal computing devices at bedtime or in bed is notorious for causing sleep onset insomnia because these devices emit blue light, and blue light is one of the major drivers of delaying this circadian rhythm that I've mentioned so many times. So if you expose yourself to blue light in the evening or at bedtime, it's going to push your sleepiness rhythm to a later time versus clock time, and you'll have more trouble falling asleep. For people who insist upon doing this, we advise them for their personal computing devices, there are free applications that they can download that drastically reduce the amount of blue light that the computing device shows on the screen. And then for televisions, there are filters that you can place over the screen to drastically reduce the amount of blue light if you insist on having the television on. These are just a few of the things that cause sleep onset insomnia. Another very common cause is called psychophysiological insomnia. And it's also called learned insomnia. And there's a so-called behavioral model for psychophysiological insomnia that begins with individuals that tend to have a higher degree of drive to be alert and awake than other individuals, but it's not high enough to prevent them from falling asleep at night. But then something happens in their life that stresses them and causes them to start having difficulty falling asleep. Their degree of wakefulness drive exceeds the threshold that allows them to fall asleep, and they have trouble falling asleep. Things like studying for the bar exam, for instance, or having a fight with your spouse or with your kids, or anything in life, a death in the family, grieving, a divorce. All of these things are very stressful events that normally will cause difficulty falling asleep when you normally would, and are expected to do that. The problem occurs if you start engaging in counterproductive activities to try to allow yourself to get enough sleep. And one of the most common ones is, well, I'm having trouble falling asleep when I want to, so I'll just sleep later into the day. But it ends up that they end up staying in bed awake for a much longer time, and associated with that being in bed and awake is the development of learned anxiety about being in bed and being in the bedroom environment. These are people who might become drowsy in the evening and think they're ready to go to bed, but as soon as they get into bed, suddenly they're anxious about whether they're going to fall asleep. They may clock watch. They may look at the clock and say, geez, I'm still awake and I have to do this pleading or that important thing the next day. And if I don't fall asleep right away, I'm in trouble. And that just increases the anxiety about not falling asleep. And it's a vicious cycle. And there are ways that involve what are called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia that involve improving what's called sleep hygiene, like not staying in bed awake too long, and other techniques that are well proven to bring the level of drive to wakefulness below the threshold back to where it was before, so that they're able to fall asleep when they want to fall asleep.
That's interesting. Do you see the majority of cases or troubles with sleep that you see, do they fall in that category in terms of something has happened in their life and they've developed this pattern of lying in bed, just being anxious, but then getting more and more anxious looking at the clock? And it is one of the things that you and your staff does is trying to help somebody develop or get back into a healthy pattern of sleeping, giving them things to do and helping them finding ways to go to sleep, like you said, within that first 30 minutes of laying down.
So that's definitely, I would say that the two most common causes of sleep onset insomnia that we see are mental health disorders and this entity called psychophysiological insomnia. The mental health disorders obviously need the care of a mental health professional, which most sleep physicians are not.
Yeah.
So we happen to have one of our sleep physicians at UNM is boarded in psychiatry and geriatric psychiatry. Another one is boarded in pediatric neurology. And we're about to bring on another psychiatrist who's finishing a sleep fellowship with us. So mental health disorders are among the top two. Psychophysiological insomnia is right up there with mental health disorders. And the way we deal with psychophysiological insomnia is under the umbrella of what I called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And there are a number of components of that. It can be very time intensive. So the initial attempt at what we'll abbreviate as CBTI is internet-based programs to initiate the processes involved in CBTI. And there's a lot of research on these internet-based programs. Usually they're not free, but they're also not that expensive. And they involve doing exactly the same things that we would do in person if we were employing CBTI to treat a patient with psychophysiological insomnia.
Yeah, very interesting. All right. Well, unfortunately, we are just about out of time, Dr. Brown. We could probably talk about this for another hour because there's so many more questions that I have. But let me, so you gave everybody your email address if somebody wanted to get a hold of you or your office and maybe make an appointment. I believe it was lkbrown@salud.unm.edu. Did I get that correct?
That's exactly right.
Okay. Is there a number that they could call if they wanted to make an appointment or find out more information about sleep?
Well, that's a little disorganized right now.
Oh.
But I can tell you the main number for the Sleep Disorders Center, which is 505, because we're about to embark on 10-digit dialing, 505-272-6110. That's the main number. And then there's a number that goes to centralized scheduling, which unfortunately I don't think I've ever had that in my memory. But if you call the main number, they will tell it to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right. Well, great topic. Such an important topic. I mean, when I have lawyers that call me or anybody in the legal profession that's calling me and telling me they're struggling, one of the questions I always ask them is what does your sleep look like and how much are you getting? And so it's just so important. It's one of those, are you getting enough exercise? What's the stress level like in your day? Those kind of things. So I love that we talked about it today. I love that we gave a little bit of information. I think we just kind of scratched the surface on how important sleep is and some things that people can do if they find themselves struggling with it. And I just want to tell you again how grateful I am that you are here, that you had this conversation with us, and I so appreciate the work that you do. And any last 15-second comment before we wrap it up?
Well, just to say it was my pleasure. I know attorneys have a very difficult lifestyle, and adopting the best habits that allow a good night's sleep can be difficult, but that they should also be aware that there are sleep disorders that can be treated, like restless leg syndrome and obstructive sleep apnea and periodic limb movement disorder and a whole host of things that are treated in various ways that if they are experiencing sleep difficulties, they should consult with a sleep medicine professional. That's what we're here for.
Yes, great. Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. And thank you all for joining us on Legal Wellbeing in Action. And we will see you for next month's topic.
Thank you for listening. This episode was produced by the State Bar of New Mexico's Wellbeing Committee and the New Mexico Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program. All editing and sound mixing was done by Blue Sky eLearn. Intro music is by Gil Flores. The views of the presenters are that of their own and are not endorsed by the State Bar of New Mexico. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, or legal advice. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition.